the 2 years preceding the 1924 election, there had been 3 general elections and 4 prime ministers.
You're joking. Not another one? Oh, for God's sake, I can't stand this. There's too much politics going on at the moment.
It was a period that saw both the end of the last Liberal Prime Minister and the first Labour Prime Minister elected, and the 1924 election would see yet another change of Prime Minister and government, with Stanley Baldwin leading the Conservative Party to a landslide election victory, just over 9 months on from losing office at the previous election. It was a time of real flux and upheaval in British politics, and despite the 1924 election being a defeat for Labour, it actually represented a watershed moment for them as a party, as, whilst Labour lost 40 seats at the election, the Liberals lost 118 seats, which further cemented Labour as the natural alternative to the Conservatives in British politics. Labour had come to power after the Conservative Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, called an early election in the winter of 1923 to seek a mandate to introduce a more protectionist trade policy in a bid to tame unemployment. The 1923 election proved disastrous for the Conservative Party as Baldwin struggled to articulate his argument for protection to the public and failed to put forward a broader programme. This allowed the Liberals and Labour to attack his proposal and to define the election as a cost of living election, arguing that tariffs on imports would push up prices and lower living standards. The result was a hung parliament, with Baldwin's Conservatives being the largest party but unable to govern. His government lost a vote of confidence in the House of Commons, and Baldwin recommended to the King that he call Ramsay MacDonald the Labour leader. There was some debate within the Labour Party about whether they should form a government, with only 191 seats in the House of Commons, well short of a majority. But MacDonald concluded that Labour could not be seen to refuse the call to take office, and so the first Labour government was formed, which would govern as a minority government for just over 9 months. Due to Labour's lack of a parliamentary majority, MacDonald took on a greater role in foreign affairs, an area of policy where he didn't need to rely upon a parliamentary majority to act. As a result, he took on the role of Foreign Secretary as well as Prime Minister. His biggest achievement in this arena was helping to resolve the crisis that occurred as France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr in response to Germany's failure to meet its reparations obligations by persuading the French government to sign up to the Dawes Plan, which committed Germany to a timetable for reparations payments in exchange for the withdrawal of French and Belgian troops. Labour was elected on a platform of practical idealism, and they would be forced by their precarious position in Parliament to govern in this spirit, jettisoning their more radical policies and making piecemeal reforms in a number of areas. Their biggest domestic achievement in their first brief period of office was the Wheatley Housing Act, which would lead to the construction of over 500,000 rent-controlled homes over the next decade, and which would set up a system of council housing that would allow councils to provide public housing to those in need of it. MacDonald's moderation in domestic policy may have allayed people's fears of what a Labour government might mean, but it was also arguably a missed opportunity to put forward a more radical programme, forcing the opposition to vote it down, thereby triggering an election where Labour could seek a fresh mandate for a bolder programme of reform. The fact that the Labour Party under MacDonald opted for moderation and respectability was a sign that Labour would stay true to its reformist instincts and that the threat of socialism was widely overstated by Labour's detractors. But you wouldn't think it from the Red Scare that was to define the 1924 election campaign. The election was triggered by the government's response to the prosecution for sedition of John Ross Campbell, who was then editor of the communist publication The Workers' Weekly. Campbell had penned an open letter calling for British soldiers to refuse to fire on striking workers and to rise up and overthrow capitalism instead. The offending paragraph read, quote, "Soldiers, sailors, airmen, flesh of our flesh and bone of our bone, the Communist Party calls upon you to begin the task of not only organising passive resistance when war is declared or when an industrial dispute involves you, but to definitely and categorically let it be known that, neither in the class war nor a military war will you turn your guns on your fellow workers, but instead will line up with your fellow workers in an attack upon the exploiters and capitalists and will use your arms on the side of your own class." Labour's Attorney General, Sir Patrick Hastings, had initially recommended that Campbell be charged with sedition for penning the article, but he backed down after facing opposition from Labour backbenchers, which allowed Liberal and Conservative members to argue that Labour were being controlled by the radical left. When a motion was put forward calling for an inquiry, MacDonald said he would treat it as an issue of confidence, and after losing the vote, he called for an early dissolution of Parliament and a general election. Both the Liberals and the Conservatives focused on attacking the Labour Party during the campaign because of their supposed links with the Soviet Union. This was partly due to the Campbell affair, but was also due to the fact that MacDonald's government had recognised the Soviet Union and was in the middle of negotiating with them on a treaty that aimed to get the Soviet Union to honour money owed to British bondholders dating from the pre-revolutionary period in exchange for a British loan. Right at the beginning of the Liberal Manifesto, these points were addressed explicitly. Quote, "The country is being plunged into a general election for the third time in 2 years. This election has been forced on us by the Labour Prime Minister and his government for 2 reasons. First, they were not prepared to face an impartial inquiry into the circumstances which led to the withdrawal of a prosecution against a communist writer for inciting to mutiny in the Navy and Army. Next, they wished to evade parliamentary discussion of a reckless proposal to guarantee, at the risk of the British taxpayer, a loan to the communist government of Russia." This charge, that there was a connection between the Labour Party and the USSR, was to be the dominant theme of the campaign, especially after the publication of the Zinoviev letter in the Daily Mail just 4 days before the election. The letter purported to be a letter from Moscow to the British Communist Party. So whilst it didn't purport to show a direct link between Labour and the Soviet Union, it was enough to fuel the Red Scare, especially as the government acted as if the letter were genuine, even though MacDonald suspected correctly it was a fraud. The result in the end was a Conservative landslide after their vote increased by 8.8%, giving them 412 seats and a majority of 209 in the House of Commons. And, although they lost 40 seats, the Labour vote also increased by 2.6%, due in part to them standing in more seats than in 1923. But for the Liberal Party, who had helped trigger the election by voting against the government in the confidence vote, the election was a disaster. Their vote was down by 11.9 percentage points, leading to the loss of 118 seats. The Liberal Party was therefore left with a rump of 40 seats, and, as we now know, they would never to this day get over 100 seats in the House of Commons again. Ultimately, the dominant theme of this election was the Liberal Party being squeezed by their rivals, which was helped by the fact that the leader of the Conservative Party, Stanley Baldwin, had abandoned protectionism and embraced free trade, which eliminated one of the biggest reasons people would have to vote Liberal. There just isn't space in the first-past-the-post system for 3 major parties, and it would seem that the rise of Labour and the decline of the Liberal Party was almost inevitable. There will be a slight recovery for the Liberals at the next election, driven in part by the Conservative leader, Stanley Baldwin, once again embracing protectionism, but the writing was very much on the wall, and after this point in British history, the significance of the Liberal Party diminishes, and British politics becomes a battle between Labour and the Conservative Party. Well, I hope you liked this video. Why not take the opportunity to like and subscribe to the channel, and why not check out some of my other videos. For now, goodbye, and best wishes.